This lesson is going to be looking at the media and sport. Now, if we look on your specification, there's quite a lot you need to know about the media and sport. So we're going to look at three main things: the coverage of sport by the media and the reasons for its changes since the 1980s. So you need to know about TV, radio, written press and the internet. And that's what this video is going to be focusing on. The next video you'll be watching, once we've covered this topic, will be on the bottom 2 points on here. But for this lesson only, we're going to be looking at the coverage of sport in the media today and how it's changed since the 1980s. So we're going to look at the 1980s. There were only really accessible global events in the 1980s were the Olympics and the World Cup. And you mainly got male presenters on TV presenting the sport, and it was mainly just male sports. So in the 1980s, the coverage of sport was significantly different to now. Sky TV, pay-per-view subscriptions, the advancement in the internet and apps all help sport be seen by a range of people across the world nowadays, which just didn't exist back in the 1980s. So here's a little table which shows you a summary of sports coverage from the 1980s to today. So if we look for terrestrial TV, coverage in the 1980s, so on BBC we used to have the FA Cup final and horse racing. Modern day, we've now got the Olympics, we've got Wimbledon, we've got the FA Cup. On satellite, didn't really have it in the 1980s too much, especially early 1980s. Whereas now, we can see Champions League. Pay-per-view wasn't a thing in the 80s. Modern day now, we've got a lot of boxing on the pay-per-view. Radio, there wasn't any radio stations back then. Now we've got specific radio stations. This is a nice little table to get down to give you a few examples of how the media has changed since the 1980s. If we look at the 1990s then, it started to really change because Sky started to come in and it started to buy the rights to televise football matches. Underrepresented activities still remain. Female and disabled sports don't really get much, but they certainly get more coverage now than they used to get before. So TV has really evolved. If we look terrestrial or free-to-air TV like BBC and ITV, sport was not constantly available. Okay, you wouldn't have Sunday afternoon football, you wouldn't have anything. It'd be very, very rare. FA Cup final would be about it. You do have protective events, so there are protective events that have to be covered by free-to-air channels. So Wimbledon has to be on free TV for everyone, like BBC. We've also got satellite and cable subscriptions. You've got constant access to sport as much as you want, but you've obviously got to pay to access these. We've also got pay-per-view events where you pay a one-off fee to watch it. Usually happens in boxing, world championship fights, etc. Now, television has enabled rewinding of live TV, slow motion replays. It allows audience and spectators to relive a moment or capture something that they've just missed. Sport has now become a massive, massive part of the entertainment industry. You can view in 3D and 4K, so you've even got a better viewing experience there. You've got multi-screen, and you can access through the red button all these different options of how to view it. You've also got increased access to minority sports and female and disabled sports as well through Sky TV. Now, there are certain shows, like I said, that have to be free to air. So we've got Olympics and Paralympics. We've got Derby and racing. We've got FIFA World Cup finals, Scottish Cup finals, FA Cup, Grand National, European Championship football, Rugby World Cup finals. There are certain events that have to be shown free to air. Now, the internet has also evolved. We've got websites now which have news. Each team has their own website, national governing bodies. YouTube, you can watch video clips of highlights of a player, matches. They show and stream live matches now as well. Social media, following teams and sports stars to try and get a bit of a greater understanding of sport. And this live stream or on-demand watching has really increased over the last few years. You can watch live footage of games absolutely anywhere and at any time. So when you're traveling on a train, you can just watch any sport you want, really. And it's this idea that the internet is bringing about multimedia. You can read, you can listen, you can watch. You've got far better coverage now than, for example, when I was growing up watching sport. It was basically the BBC. Now, the internet has given people this 24/7 access to websites and clubs and social media accounts, podcasts, video sharing, checking up on results. And a good example to bring into your answers is Twitter. Now, Twitter signed deals with the big four sports in the US, NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, and the National Hockey League to live stream their games. And they now also got a deal with Sky, so they're showing some Premier League highlights as well. They've got Wimbledon Championships where they've live streamed games as well. Now, it's free to sign up for Twitter, and you get all of these amazing benefits. And all their money, because Twitter have to make money, is coming from advertisements. That's how they're making their money. Now, there's also more sports available to live stream. There was the Olympics, we're live streaming on BBC. And the big benefit of the internet is you can watch on demand. You can catch up at any time you want. You can watch it while you're traveling, outside the home, on your phone. You don't really need a TV anymore to watch sport. And you can watch an awful lot of it for free, which is a massive benefit to people. Now, radio has also evolved. Local and national radio, occasional mentions of sport broadcasting there. Back in the 1980s, there wasn't much. You might get a bit on the news, but now we've got dedicated radio channels where sport is the only topic that they talk about. So if you listen to Talk Sport, a whole show all day is going to be about sport. You've got BBC 5 Live Sports Extra. With DAB radio, digital radio, you've got far more variety. You can access all stations from across the world, not just local radio stations. Now, with the written press, we're looking at newspapers, magazines. Newspapers obviously give columns and pages to different sports. You can read about results and fixtures. We've got magazines, which are specialist sporting magazines. There could be 442 for football or Runner's World. However, this form of media is reducing. Less people are starting to buy these magazines or newspapers, when essentially you can get the same information for free online. And one good thing about written press, though, is it is far less sexist in its gender representation of sport. Okay, it's far less gender representation now than there was back in the 1980s. Females get far more coverage in newspapers and magazines than they would have done in the 1980s. So, as a little bit of a recap here, how has media coverage changed since the 1980s? Well, we've got many different types of media now. The internet is a massive evolution in how we view sport. We've got more coverage of sport. You can watch it 24/7 now. There's an increasing amount of paid for or subscription coverage. There's globalized coverage. You can watch the Super Bowl, Olympics in any country or any sporting event anywhere in the world now. We've got increasingly important role of social media to get a deeper understanding of sports and clubs. There's a wider variety of sports being covered. Now, different genders, disabilities, minority sports, all getting a bit of a viewing on Sky or other subscriptions. There's creation of sports stars in the media and the positive role models that they can bring about. Technology is giving us sort of real-time sport that can be controlled. We can pause, rewind live sporting events to get a greater sense of the sport. And the media has a growing control over sport as well. Okay, they're starting to dictate sport times, where games are being held, and all of these things are changes that have taken place since the 1980s. Now, one thing that could come up is how media coverage of women's sport has changed. So obviously they've got more coverage now, so there's a great amount of hours devoted to women's sport than there was in the 1980s. Regarding presenters, there's far more female presenters now than there were in the 1980s, which was mainly male dominated. There's more women's sport, football, rugby, netball, all on Sky, all on TV now, whereas that wasn't the case in the 1980s. It's less sexist. There's far more coverage of women's sport and focusing on the sport, whereas in the 1980s it may have been, or 1990s even, may have been more on how the females looked than their actual sport. And finally, it's far more mainstream. There's far more sport on premier channels like Sky Sports, focusing on women's sport, and far more live coverage than there ever was in the 1980s. So again, we'll go over a bit more of this in class. Make sure you've got these notes down.